Thanking him
Yep.
for participating.
So, Leroy, if you just state your name and then we'll go right into it.
Okay. Leroy Hopkins.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hopkins. Thank you so much for participating in our seventh Ward Discovering Our Treasures or oral research project. I'd like to ask you a number of questions about your childhood and going forward to present day. I know you've resided in the southeast area, also known as the Seventh Ward. Can you tell me how you and your family came to Lancaster, or were you born here?
I was born in Lancaster, but my family's from the county. My mother was born in Conestoga in 1912. And then my grandfather, whose name was Edward Pico, he moved into the city. Why, I don't know. But he moved into the city sometime around 1908, which was actually before my mother was born. So he was probably going back and forth. And he had a hauling business, and he also was a farmer. As a matter of fact, where the Southeast Area Health Campus is now, down on South Duke Street, that was a field at one time, and my grandfather grew corn there. And as I said, I was born on North Street, 419 North Street. And then sometime during my childhood, my family moved to 532 North Street, and we lived there until 1955. And that was North Street was the center of my universe. And all of my friends lived either on North Street, Christian Street, South Christian, or on Chester or on Green Street. So it was the southeast area, 7th Ward was the hub of my early childhood.
Who were some of your neighbors?
Well, on North Street, on the right-hand side, that would have been 534. That was Wilson Jones, and he was a World War I veteran. I discovered later. He lived with his mother and his father, and they had funny conversations, which I probably shouldn't go into here. We had an outdoor toilet, so I spent a lot of time in our yard. And the other side, 530 North Street, that's where there was apartments there, and Mary Lou and Mark Pitt lived there. They had two boys that they raised. I don't think they were their own children, Johnny and Frankie Bland, and they were my playmates at one point. My chief friend, however, lived on Atlantic Avenue. That was Clyde Brown, or Dumpy, as we called him. And I knew Punky Brady, who lived up the street on Atlantic Avenue. Another friend was Cynthia Williams, who lived on South Christian. Shirley Lucas, who lived on Atlantic Avenue. And we had a little group. I collected comic books, and we exchanged them. And there was a white girl. Her name was Nancy. I can't remember her last name. But they were frequently at my house, and I was sometimes at their house. Reverend Butcher's, of course now Reverend Butcher's mother, Miss Susie Butcher, was a good friend of my mother's. Both of them were in Eastern Star. And I think, I don't remember. I don't know if it was Mrs. Butcher or Reverend Carr was our den mother. I was a Cub Scout. And that was probably my last entree into organized recreation, because I was always a loner. One of the things that I remember my mother used to tease me about, when I was about 6 years old, 6 or 7, she took me to her sister's house. Her sister, Aunt Bessie, lived in the 400 block of North Street. And she put me in the door and said, "Bessie, he's here." And I was too bashful to take my coat off or sit down. I stood inside the door until my mother came from work at 5 o'clock. So from about 8 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock, I stood inside the door.
You stood inside the
And this
door.
was a relative that I knew.
Okay.
I was just strange then,
Okay.
probably stranger now. But I had a lot of memories of North Street. A lot of the time, though, later, I played by myself. I remember there was an alleyway that went from North Street up to Chester between the houses. See, a cousin of mine lived on the corner of Atlantic Avenue at North Street. That was Miss Libby, Elizabeth Carter. She was related to my mother's family. And then the Craigs lived on the other side of Mr. Cy Burroughs. And Eddie Craig was a playmate also. Down the street at 540 were the Polites. Although Nelson Polite Jr. was younger than I was. I found out recently that my sister was his first girlfriend, and he gave me some pictures of that. But we were a sort of enclosed community, and I had various interests. You know, you might want to know what sort of toys I had.
I am curious, what sort of toys did you play with?
Everything related to westerns, because my mother took me to see westerns up until I was 7.
Some of my favorite toys were related to westerns.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
My favorite toys were westerns, or related to westerns. For example, when my adenoids and tonsils were taken out when I was 7, my mother brought me a statue of Trigger, Roy Rogers' horse.
Yes.
And I remember that fondly. I have no idea where it's at now. Both my mother and I are pack rats. We never throw anything away. And probably after I move, I'll find it somewhere in some nook or cranny. But my fascination with westerns goes back to my mother taking me to the Hamilton. And at the Hamilton Theater, you would get to see a chapter picture, you see a series of cartoons, there was a newsreel, and then a double feature. And Hopalong Cassidy, Wild Bill Elliott, those were some of my heroes. Hoot Gibson, Lash LaRue. I saw every Saturday we went to the movies. That was easy to do because it only cost 9 cents to go to the movies.
9 cents.
And my allowance was 15 cents. And so I had enough money to buy a box of candy, and I had a penny left over, and I'd buy penny candy on Monday on the way to school. But most of my recreation came by myself.
By yourself.
I sat at home. When I got old enough, I started going to the library. Then I started reading.
I just stop you for a
Yeah,
second.
stop doing that.
I'm sorry, that's how I am.
You can't do that.
Do that.
You can't make any noises at all.
But I did in the previous one.
But then we have to edit all that
All
out.
that has to be edited out. That's
Okay.
what that is.
That's a lot of work.
Okay, I'm not to respond, I just stare at you.
Uh-huh. That's what you're doing.
I know I'm doing it, that's my natural self.
Yeah, what's your?
Okay, we'll try. I will try, but that's my natural self.
Please do, because I don't wanna go through all this.
Okay.
Keep saying, oh, this and
Well, the problem is if it's over top of something you want to keep, you can't edit it out. So
that's it.
All right. Now what?
just continue on.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So sub-vocalize the next question.
And you repeat the question when she asked you.
What? What?
So one of your favorite, and I'm making this up, guys, so you're gonna have to edit this out. So I'm trying to get to, as a child, you were drawn towards the Western movies. Can you tell me if you dressed as a cowboy?
sure.
'Cause that was very common back then.
Oh, yes. Yeah, my love of westerns found expressions not only in the toys that were bought for me, but also because of my dress. My father bought me a complete cowboy outfit. I had cowboy boots with spurs. I had a pair of chaps. I had a vest. I had a two-gun holster and a cowboy hat. And one of my early memories, besides one time, my father told me about this. We had a dog. I was about 5 years old, and I stood at the top of the steps and threw the dog down the steps and said, "Doggy, go boom." My mother didn't say anything, but one time my father was coming home, and I had my outfit on, and I wanted to impress him with my outfit, and I run down the steps, tripped, and the only thing saved me from landing on my head was one of my spurs got caught in the side of the step. And I think that was the last time I wore it. Because I had a sort of I guess a pathological fear of injury. I never learned to roller skate. My father bought me a pair of roller skates, and I went up on the sidewalk. Our sidewalk was made out of brick. I told you that next door was apartments where Mary Lou and Mark Pitt lived. The next door was Mrs. There was a German woman. I've forgotten her name. I just remember she had ulcers on her legs. And then next to that was the bag factory, and that was concrete and smooth. So I put on the skates, went about 10 feet, fell, got up, took off the skates, never put them on again. The only really toy I had that moved me forward, I had a tricycle. I tried that a couple times. Never learned to ride a bicycle though. I didn't like the idea of hitting the ground. The ground was too hard, and maybe I was too soft. But Westerns, I loved Westerns. Not only seeing them, but I also read Westerns. When I was in junior high school for me was Edward Hand. That's when the public library was finally opened, about 1953. I went to the library and I read every Western I could get my hands on. I read so many of them that I could figure out how it ended. So I stopped reading those. Then I went to mystery stories. And then finally, the last genre I got involved in was science fiction. And some people don't believe it, but in the summers, now this is at 532 North Street, I didn't go out to play. I would sit in the house and I could read 4 books a day, about 1,000 pages. And that helped me when it came time to take standardized tests, that I had a very good reading capacity. But we didn't get a television until I was 7. And so when we got the television, then I'd watch Sally Starr, Gabby Hayes, Hopalong Cassidy. Those were what we'd like to watch. And it was also sort of escape from the reality around me.
Can you say a little bit more about that, the reality around you?
Well, one of the things is the house that we lived in, there were 6 rooms, a attic, an unfinished basement, outdoor toilet, and it was my job in the winter to carry the slop jar every morning and dump it in the toilet. That was not one of my favorite activities. We had no central heat. We had a bucket a day stove that was in the living room, and it used kerosene. And it was my job to go down, it was a half a block, because our church, Bethel AME, was on the corner of Strawberry and North, well, opposite North Street. And right next to the church was a little gas station and candy store, Almonds. And I would buy, my father would give me money in the wintertime. I'd go down there and get a 5-gallon can of kerosene and carry it back. Well, back in those days, we're talking about late 40s, early 50s, there were almost no cars on the street at night. And I was scared because it was dark, and I would walk down the middle of the street to carry this kerosene home. And usually a cheap pair of pants you would buy then were corduroy. And the corduroy pants would go, scratch, 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 and would echo off the walls. I would look like this. Even though I was sort of a scaredy cat, one of my favorite type of movie were horror movies. My mother loved horror movies. And so I'd go to the Hamilton, see a double feature of Frankenstein, Dracula, or whatever. And usually in the wintertime, when the movie finished, it was already dark. So I'd run all the way home. And everyone needs to be scared a little bit. Life is not, you can't enjoy life unless you've been scared a little bit. But that was basically what I did. I read, I would watch television, and I played by myself. Playmates, I guess I had no playmates when I was a teenager. Didn't need them. I had my books.
So you had your books.
Mhm.
And it sounds like you shifted from the Western genre
To mysteries.
mysteries.
And then I shifted then finally to science fiction, which I still read. I figure I've read maybe 1,000 science fiction novels.
Wow.
At one time, I had read all of the science fiction novels they had at the county library. The reason I shifted was they became too predictable. Reading a Western, I only needed to read the first chapter and I could figure out how it was going to end. Because the good guy always got the girl at the end. So what's the sense of finishing it? And the mysteries, I could always figure out who the killer was. So But I still had my heroes. Actually, I've never read them. Charlie Chan movies, I love those. One of the writers that I actually read was Edgar Rice Burroughs, the Tarzan movies, and they were a challenge in terms of vocabulary. It was a way of expanding vocabulary, uh, and uh, and I remember, well, of course, in science fiction, I had a number of authors that I really liked. I still occasionally go back and reread books that I've read already.
So books were a very important part of your life growing up.
My mother encouraged me to read. My father wasn't much of a reader. He had to leave school when he was in 8th grade because he grew up on a farm and it was time to earn money. My mother actually got as far as the 11 and a half grade. Back then, the school was divided into half years, and she did not get a high school diploma. But when she was in her 60s, she got her GED, and she always prized learning. You know, this is something you need to do. She actually got me started for school. She taught me the alphabet and a whole bunch of nursery rhymes, some of which I still remember. Because I started school in 1947.
Do you remember going to any parks or recreational spots as you were growing up? I know books were central for you.
Well, one of the spots I would go to for recreation was Crispus Attucks. But my mother worked there. She was a assistant cook, and I'd go there for hot lunch projects. And that's where I got a little bit. My mother was very self-confident. She would not take any guff from anyone. And I remember I was perhaps 9 years old, 10 years old. And of course, the hot lunch project there was run by the women of the, the Council of Churches, mainly white women. And they would come, and I remember one of them saying to my mother, "Don't all of these children look alike?" And my mother said, "No, my son doesn't look anything like them." And so she wouldn't take anything from anyone. And I remember one time we went to the 5 and 10s. Of course, downtown Lancaster, you had McCroy's, Woolworths, and Greens. And one time we went into McCroy's, and there were about 15 of us waiting to be served. And they were all white. My mother and I were the only ones not white. And the clerk tried to overlook my mother. And she spoke up, "Hey, I'm next. My money's just as good as theirs," and embarrassed the clerk, and she got waited on. That was the type of person my mother was. And I'm sure she got that from her father, because my grandfather, as I said, lived in Conestoga. And Conestoga is where the local Ku Klux Klan got started. And one of the stories I learned from one of my mother's sisters was that apparently my grandfather's daughters were being harassed in the store, and the country store. And he went in and told them, "Look, if any of you mess with my daughters, you have me to deal with." And apparently he was a mean character. He could squeeze a man until he would say uncle.
How do you think your mother's words may have impacted you in terms of growing up as an African American in the Southeast area, in the 7th Ward, hearing that comment that she made?
Oh, it gave me a sense. My mother's words influenced me not only as an African American, she also pushed me unconsciously into learning German. Because, see, my mother was at least half German. And so she would use German words that I didn't understand. And then later when I started taking a language, I realized, oh, my mom said that. And I would challenge her on some things. You know, she would say, she had Dutchified word order. And she said, well, my mother's was German. And see, her mother's maiden name was Stump. The oil company here are cousins of ours. And one of the things I've done as an adult is do research on the family. And so her words of encouragement, I'll tell you another anecdote. My mother got me jobs because growing up in the Southeast area, if you were a teenager, there were no jobs to be had. The only work that was available even for adults were sweeping floors or shining shoes. And I'm talking about black adults. And so my mother found me a series of jobs, sometimes jobs that my father worked at also. So it cut grass, weed, and one of the places we went to was Dr. Walter Blankenship. And that connection was very important for me because he was the trustee at Millersville State College. And when I was looking for a college, my mother talked to him and got me an interview at Millersville. But they lived on Sunset Drive. I think it's Sunset Drive, which is in Manheim Township, I believe. And we went there by bus, on the Lidditz bus. And we got to our stop. My mother pulled the cord, and the bus driver thought he was smart. He said to my mother, sunset for sunshine. And she blessed him out. He turned red in the face. And I watched this and I thought, maybe someday I'll have the courage to do that too. And fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, I've never been challenged because of race, at least not here. Once in Germany, but I've compensated for it by talking about race. Besides my professional life, I also like to give talks on local black history, and some of that comes from my mother. Although she hated talking about family, she used to tell me, "You're always looking for cousins. I got family I can't stand. So what do I need anymore?"
What were some of the major stories that you recall growing up while you were living in the 7th Ward that may have an impact or may have had an impact on you?
Well, one of the stories that happened, it happened in the year that we moved from North Street, and that was the murder of Emmett Till. Here was a young African American from Chicago who was murdered in Mississippi, and he was about my age. In 1955, I was 13. He was 13 or 14, and it sort of told me that there was no security. If you're a black person, you're at risk in this society, and that was one. I remember, for example, I don't think I saw it on television. I must have heard it on the radio because my first love was radio, listening to The Shadow, Inner Sanctum, some of the old shows where you had to imagine what was happening. It wasn't just all visual. And I remember Thomas Dewey running against Harry Truman. And I remember seeing in the paper where they were predicting that Dewey would win, and of course Truman won. And I guess that sort of influenced me to become a Democrat. 1952, I was a supporter of Adlai Stevenson. I thought he should be president, and instead Eisenhower became president. Of course, I couldn't vote yet. I was only 10 years old then. But I admired those political stories. Weather was also a story. The first hurricane I experienced was Hurricane Hazel in the 1950s. It was memorable because we got out of school early, and so I had a chance to go home. I was at Han then. Others, I was very much interested in astronautics. I read science fiction, and I remember being totally downcast when Sputnik went up. I was in general science class, and I thought we lost our chance. we should have had something in orbit. The WAC Corporal missile was available. They used the V2 that had been captured from the Germans, and in 1949, it reached an altitude of 250 miles. It would have been very simple to put an object in space, but that was not the interest of the military. And another thing I remember, in 1955, also Einstein died. And I was really, it sounds silly, but I was hoping he would come up with the unified field theory. In high school, I wanted to be a nuclear physicist. But thank God, the math was not the thing I was interested in. I had a teacher in high school who taught, I won't say names because his son's still alive. He took over and taught a college physics class, and he could take the Pythagorean theorem, one of the easiest formulas there is in physics, and make it so you couldn't understand it. And so I lost my interest in physics. I got a, I think I got a C plus in that course, which was the same as a B in a regular course. But that pushed me towards the humanities. And I said, oh, no, none of this. Although one of the subjects that I really liked was history. Somehow I got the award in 8th grade from the DAR for excellence in American history. Excuse me. And that kept with me. And when I got to college, I wanted to major in sociology, which was, now I look back on it, I thought, what a dumb decision that would have been.
Could you say a little bit about the DAR?
DAR, Daughters of American Revolution. It's an all-white organization, or was at the time I got the award. And they were looking for heroes, promoting usually their own family members. And I thought nothing about them. I'm just surprised to get this award because being a black student, there was very little recognition given to students of color in school. During my time, there were no blacks in the National Honor Society. The only time we got to see our guidance counselor was when we were in trouble, or if you were the exception, you were going to college. Because at McCaskey, where I went, there were 1,800 students, and there were 2 guidance counselors, one for girls, one for boys. And I saw my guidance counselor exactly 2 times in 3 years. That wasn't, black kids were not part of that, of their job description. I had sort of mixed experiences with school. I started, as I think I mentioned, I started school at Adam Reichert School, 1947. I flunked kindergarten and then went to reading and readiness. And it's funny, I can't remember the kindergarten teacher, but I remember the teacher at reading and readiness, Miss Clan. She was very nice, chubby, typical, maybe she was a spinster. But years later, I found out there was a scandal that the kindergarten teacher who had flunked me had allegedly for 25 years, flunked every minority kid that went through her classroom. And no one noticed.
No one noticed.
No one noticed. But it didn't affect me because from 1st grade into 6th grade, when we had the achievement test, I usually ended up first in the class. And one of the things you can see the cruelty back then, I remember in 3rd grade, or 3rd or 4th grade, they would seat us according to our results on the achievement test. So I got to sit in the first row in the first seat, whereas the kid who sat in the last row in the last seat, that was the dummy of the class. And of course now you would never do anything like that. That would totally destroy someone's self-respect. And then in 6th grade they changed the system, and I was no longer the genius of the class. Well, didn't bother me any, because I discovered later there were flaws in the system. I finished college, went to graduate school. I started graduate school in 1966.
Can I ask where you went to college?
I went to Millersville State College. It was then called Millersville State College. It's Millersville University now. And the reason I got in was because my mother worked for one of the trustees, and he got me an interview. But the reason I was able to go that first year was because of Dr. Copper, our family physician. He paid for my first semester at Millersville and bought me a sweater. Those 2 items together cost $100. So he spent $100 for one of his patients. And then I had a job. After high school, I worked as a busboy at the Brunswick. I got all of 90 cents an hour. And my take-home, though, was $40 because I worked an average of 10, 12 hours a day, and sometimes 7 days a week. And my mother was afraid I wouldn't get to go to college. That's why she talked to her employer. And then I got another job that my mother also set up, working at food fair at the Lancaster Shopping Center. That shopping center had just opened a couple years before. Excuse me. And I started as a bagger there, made $1.38 an hour, and my take-home was about $15, $20 a week. And with that, I paid for college at Millersville. I spent 5 years there. One of the years was I was my junior year abroad. I went to Germany because when I became a student, I was asked, "What do you want to major in?" And it was sociology. And thank goodness they didn't have it as a major because I'd probably be unemployed now. And so I said, "Well, history. I got an award in history." So I took history as a major. And they said, "Well, you have to take a minor." Well, I said, "Well, a minor?" Well, I liked German, so I took German as a minor, and I discovered that I hated the history program, but loved the German. And then in my second year, when I was majoring in German, one of the students, a friend of mine who was from East Berlin, her name was Annelie Dimlich, and Annelie said, Professor Beam, who ran the program, this new program, says he wants to know why you haven't applied to go to Germany. I said, "Well, I don't think I'm qualified. Besides, I don't have any money." And she said, "Well," he said, "go ahead and apply." I applied, was accepted, and I guess I must have told my mother about it because then she said something to Mrs. Butcher, Susie Butcher, and they organized a program, and Leroy Hopkins Day. I have one of the tickets, and it was $1 per ticket, and you got a turkey dinner, but the problem was the turkey spoiled, so they got chicken instead. And I got something like $400
And this was a fundraiser?
fundraiser for me
Yeah.
in August of 1963. And I told my students later, when I was teaching at Millersville, that there were 400 people who wanted me out of town. So they raised the tickets. And then with that, and I borrowed money. And when I look back, now this is 53 years ago, transportation, room and board at the German university for a whole year cost $1,500. You couldn't touch it for that now. And so that was subsidized with loans and then also money given to me. And that got me started. I decided German was something I wanted to do.
What was your experience like as a student at Millersville?
It was, that's sort of interesting. I was a commuter at Millersville. I don't drive. I still don't drive today. So I would ride the bus, and I had no time for activities because I had to get to work. Because I worked 3 days a week, later 4 days a week, so I could stay in college. I got to know all of the deans. I knew the president. And that president at the time, it was Dr. Luke B. Misturfer. And he was a good friend of someone, Caleb Bucher, who grew up with my father. My father went to school in the Quarryville area. My father was born in East Drumore Township, and one of his quasi-classmates was Caleb Bucher. And so I got to know the president. Excuse me, he retired when I was in Germany, but 15 years later, I came to the faculty, and he remembered me. He knew my name. He had a phenomenal memory. Actually, one of my classmates was his granddaughter, and she and I served on the Historical Society board together. But in terms of what you felt as an African American,
Yes.
1961 was the first time that the enrollment at Millersville exceeded that of McCaskey. So there was 1,820 students. In my class, there were 3 of us who were black. Pat Fisher from York, Dawn Lacey from Marietta, and myself. And there was very little social interaction. There were no sororities or fraternities back then. And the only thing I was interested in was doing something in my studies. Although I was never a great student. My overall average was something like 2.5, but in my major, German, I had a 3.8, almost 4.0. And then after being in Germany, one of the things that helped me there was, again, having no money. Our director took pity on me and found me a possibility. It's called the Experiment in International Living. And I spent 2 weeks living with a German family, and they spoke only German. So I was totally immersed, and I got the point. I knew that I loved this language, and then when I came back, I took an extra senior year, in part to avoid the draft, and also in part because I didn't feel really comfortable in my second major, which was Russian, and I had had a year of Russian before I went to Germany. I was not allowed to take it while I was there. And so when I came back, I sort of crammed Russian. In 2 years, I took 30 credits in Russian, plus kept up the German. So the graduation rate then was you had to have 120 credits to graduate. I graduated with 176. And what really told me that German was for me was I took an independent study with Professor Beam, who had encouraged me to go to Germany. And I did a paper for him. The title is totally incomprehensible today. Drama as the locus for the ontological moment. There was a philosophical history of drama. And he asked me to come to his class and talk about my project. Well, classes then were 75 minutes. It was Tuesday, Thursday, usually for upper level courses. So I go to the class. I go to the blackboard. I start writing on the blackboard. I'm talking all in German. And I talk for 75 minutes in German. And I realized afterwards, wow, I can do this. And so I got a chance. One of my other professors was a German by the name of Dr. Johanna Behrendt. She was from Berlin, a Jewish woman who was getting reparations because she was a victim of the Holocaust. And she wrote me a recommendation, and I got accepted at two places, Middlebury and Harvard. And I sort of went, I said, let me think about this for a second. Harvard, I'll go to Harvard. And so I started at Harvard in '66 and got my degree finally 8 years later. But with another year thrown in, I had a chance to go back to Germany and do research on my dissertation.
Which degree did you get at Harvard?
PhD. Yeah, I was interested in. Initially, I wanted to write about there was a German writer named Paul Celan who had translated 3 Russian writers into German. And initially, I wanted to do that as a dissertation. But after I started looking at it, I thought, my Russian wasn't good enough. Luckily, I had a professor at Harvard who's now retired. He was a visiting professor, later got a full-time position at the University of Pennsylvania. I had taken a course with him on the German novel between the world wars. And I wrote a paper on an author named Alfred Döblin. And Döblin wrote what I think is one of the best German novels of the 20th century, Berlin Alexanderplatz. And I wrote a paper on his cinematic style. Well, the professor took me out for a beer and said, you need to work on that as your dissertation. I took his advice. I got this fellowship to Germany that was paid for by the German government, the German Academic Exchange Service. And I spent a year in Germany researching Döblin from 1906 to 1933. And it wasn't all academics, because that's where I met my ex and future wife.
Tell me about your experience in Germany. I mean, you've really excelled beyond the local schools,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Can you tell me about your experience when you studied abroad in
Sure.
Germany?
Well, one of the interesting things, but of course, I went to the same university twice, Philipps-Universität Marburg an der Lahn. And the Marburg University is famous because it was the first Protestant university in the world, organized in the 1520s by Philipp der Großmütige, Philip the Benevolent, who embraced Protestantism. And when I first went there, they had 7,000 students, which was a shock to me because Millersville had less than 2,000, and it seemed like the place was crawling with students. And I noticed that some of the Germans looked strange to me. Some of them had pretty curly hair. Years later, I discovered they were Afro-Germans.
Afro-Germans.
Germans whose parents, or whose father usually, was either African or African American. And that was my first introduction. There were also some strange moments. I was sort of an exotic object, although at the university there were students from all over the world, from Africa, Asia, and the New World. And I remember that experiment international living. I had to go to a little town called Elgeringhausen, which was in Westphalia. I was in the state of Hesse, and it was a detour to get there because, of course, Germany was divided then. The wall had been built in Berlin 2 years before, and it took me 8 hours to travel 40 miles. And I remember vividly being stuck in a little train station waiting for the train to come, and there was a World War II veteran, German veteran. He only had one leg, still had his uniform on, and he was staring at me like this, staring at me for about a half an hour. And finally he got up his courage and asked me, "Kommen Sie aus Japan? Are you from Japan?" I started laughing and I said, no, ich komme aus Amerika. He said, okay. And that was one of my first introductions. But I stayed with the family, and of course, I was with a group of 19 students. We were all studying. And the family I stayed with, their name was Mönch, and they had a 14-year-old daughter. I was 21, she was 14. And of course, they said, you got a German girlfriend. No. But actually, recently I reestablished contact with her. Heidi was her name. And I'm going to Germany this summer, that maybe I'll be able to, I doubt if I'll have time to go to visit with her. But she's married and lives in Freiburg. When I met her, she was 14. She's 67 now. Time flies. But the real problems in terms of racial interaction, I felt a little bit of that my second time in Germany, 69, 70. I arrived and I was greeted by someone who was one of the German students. It was the show students around, especially students from other countries. And I knew Marburg better than they did because I'd already lived there for a year. And I needed an apartment. And we were all members of what was called WUS, World University Service, WUS. And Annie Claire, French girl, was there, and a German woman that I later got to know very well, Ulla. And before I met Ulla, one of the guys said, "I'm leaving this apartment. Would you be interested in looking at it?" I said, "Sure." Well, the apartment was about twice the size of this room. It had a shower, it had a TV, it was completely furnished. And they wanted 100 marks a month, which at that time was $25 a month. I was getting 800 marks a month because I was a doctorand. In other words, I had passed my qualifying exams for the doctorate. And so I said, oh, yeah, I'll take this. I talked to the lady of the house, and she said, oh, you have to wait till my husband comes home. Well, I called a couple times. The husband never arrived. I found out later that whole little settlement was full of former SS officers. And and the family I was staying with the family for a month. They were so infuriated that they offered me the apartment, the room that I was staying in. I could live there for a year. And even their neighbors offered me rooms because they didn't like this idea of these old Nazis showing their racism. But I ended up staying in the Robert Schuman house. Robert Schuman was a French politician, and he was a Catholic, and this was a Catholic fraternity house. And the fraternity brothers told me, of course, at that time, they still have it to a certain extent. You have dueling fraternities who actually use swords and they want to get scars and so forth. And then there was the more liberal ones, and they said, we're not I have to say it in German, wir sind keine schlagende Verbindung, wir sind eine saufende Verbindung. we're not a dueling fraternity, we're a drinking fraternity. As they had a lot of parties, so I got a chance to try some good German beer. And it was at that time that I met Ulla. Ulla was studying for medicine, and she finished up a couple years later. We became engaged in August of 1970, and it took some time because I had to get back to finish up my dissertation. We finally got married in December of 1974, and the marriage didn't last long. We got divorced in 1979, but we stayed in contact. And so I'm about to have German nieces and nephews again because we're getting married sometime this year or next year.
Congratulations.
Well, wait a little while, see what happens first. But and of course, I got a chance to look at the racial situation here through her eyes. One of the reasons that we separated was I could not explain to her what it was like here because I really had never encountered really direct racism. Because growing up in Lancaster, you knew where you should go and where you shouldn't go. And trying to explain that to someone who hadn't experienced it was difficult, especially not another language. She and I almost never speak English. So we've been communicating in German for almost 40 years. But later, maybe the crisis of separation and the fact that when I came back from Germany, I lived in Germany from 1972 to 76, excuse me, and part of that time I was on my own. From 73 to 74, I lived in Frankfurt and worked at 3 different jobs, teaching English and German. And I came back, you had our little split, and I got a job with the Urban League. I was the associate director for program and planning. And one of the things I had to do was develop programs to address problems. I got to take a little sip here. It's still cold, Betty. So let me go back to the Urban League. I worked in the Urban League from 1976 to 79, and in my capacity as a planner, I had to reflect on what were the problems here that caused poverty. And it was clear to me that the reason was not lack of jobs, it was lack of preparation for jobs, and had to do with mental attitude. I came to the conclusion that at least young people did not feel rooted in this area. And so that influenced me to begin looking into black history. And I got the coffees. And
Would you like to take a break?
yeah, but a couple minutes. Let me
Okay, we're ready to roll.
sit up straight.
You were fine before.
Okay, we're rolling.
Dr. Hopkins, can you share with me what your experience was like as an African American living in Germany? You lived there for a while, and then coming back to the United States, you went to Harvard.
Well, as an African American living in Germany, it was a day-to-day experience. Some days went very well. I never really ran into big problems, except one time I wanted to punch a guy. It was after I was married. But most of the time I found acceptance, maybe because I could speak the language. And Germans love people who try to speak their language, at least the ones I ran into. And I got to develop really good relationships. First of all, the town I lived in the longest period of time, Marburg, I lived there for 5 years. And I got to know people. As a matter of fact, there was one person who remembered me from my first visit there in 63, 64. And when I ran into them in 1980, he said, "Oh yeah, I remember seeing you here back in 1963. I was, oh. But there were people who I got friendly with. I ate the same places, went to the same things. Usually they were interested in what was going on in our society because they wanted to compare the real person with what they saw in the media.
When you say our society,
American society. Because you remember, I'm living in Germany in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then later in the 90s, and our society was very much in tumult then. One of my memories from the southeast area, my church, at least the pastor of our church, Reverend Steffens, was organized the first demonstrations about social inequality in Lancaster. In July of 1963, members from the church and from the community marched in downtown Lancaster, which set out a shockwave about, there were no black faces in any of the businesses in downtown in responsible positions. If you were black and worked downtown, you swept floors, or if you were light complected, you could run an elevator. My mother ran an elevator at the Woolworth building before World War II. And so this protest really shook up people. And it was one of the reasons that the Urban League was brought here in 1964, because there was a disdain or distrust of the NAACP, because that was more grassroots, too revolutionary for the white establishment. And so they brought in the Urban League because the Urban League worked in the boardroom rather than on the street. And I was fortunate enough to get a job with the Urban League when I came back from Germany. I was looking for employment. My marriage had just dissolved. Excuse me. And so I was lucky enough to get a job with the Urban League. I was told later by the president of the Urban League, Ashley Dudley, that if I had gotten here a couple days sooner, they would have offered me the executive director position. But I was glad to be the number two because I got a chance to do the things. I learned how to write proposals. I had a chance to reflect on who I was and what this society was about. Coming back from Germany, going to Harvard, really there was not much of a transition. The academic atmosphere was such that difference was not a big thing. I had no problems because most of the people there at Harvard, they traveled abroad. They did same sort of studies that I was doing, so I was not an anomaly. I found out later, and I think this is true, that I was the first African American to get a PhD in German from Harvard. No one else had been foolish enough to do that. Because at that time, when I finished up, I got my degree in 1974, there were no jobs in German for white, black, or anything else. I remember that the number of graduate programs in German during that decade, from the 70s to the 80s, dropped by 50%. And part of the problem was overproduction. There were too many PhDs looking for jobs. In 1970, I went to the Modern Language Association conference in New York, and there were 11 of us interviewed at one time. I was ABD, all but dissertation, from Harvard. There was someone from the University of Göttingen, Princeton, University of Pennsylvania, and it was for a job in Iowa. And the chair of the language program there apologized to us because he spent 3 days from morning to night interviewing 11 people at a time. That's how bad the job market was. It was comparable in the other humanities. I knew someone who was looking for a job as a history prof, and the American History Association met in 1970 in Boston. There were 4,000 applicants who went to that. We call it a meat market because you go there to be interviewed and maybe you get a job interview. 4,000 applicants. There was one job in the whole country in history at the college level. And so it was a tough time. And I was glad to get a job, like a job at the Urban League, although I kept looking for academic positions. Because at the Urban League, I worked 90, sometimes 100 hours a week. And my ex-wife was shocked recently when I told her how much I started at. I made $10,500 working for the Urban League. If I had been in academe, I would have made maybe twice that amount. But the period of 3 years I worked for the Urban League gave me some insight into our community and into some of the deep-seated problems, what I call structural unemployment. The problem is we have had multiple generations of people who have a sense of being disconnected. They have no sense that this community, that they're part of this community. And what I proposed then was that the Urban League shift from its emphasis on employment to a shift on education. Because when someone is 30 years of age or older and has spent multiple years or decades unemployed, you're not going to find gainful employment for them. They're not going to stick to the job. And so start with the kids in the schools, develop the skills that they need, and then help them find employment. That's the way you cure the problem. The only problem with my solution was that it took too long. People want instant results. So most government programs last 3 years. Well, 3 years you barely scratch the surface. And so I was glad to get a job offer from Millersville. And what happened, it wasn't an offer. My former professor, who had convinced me to go to Germany, stopped by the Urban League office one evening and said, "We got an opening, you better apply." Well, I was one of 80 to apply for the job, and I got it. And it was funny, there were two of us who were applying. One was Bill Hopkins, and he got the job at Franklin Marshall, which I had applied for but it was not interviewed for. He was interviewed at Millersville, but I got that job. So for a while there, we had Hopkins at both institutions. Now, he was white, and of course I'm not.
What was the experience for you at Millersville to become the first African American to teach German
It was different.
with a Harvard degree?
At the Harvard degree. Actually, when I started at Millersville, I was the only one who had a Harvard degree. Even today, I don't think there's any other Harvard PhDs at Harvard or at Millersville. Well, but the transition was easy because I knew everyone. I knew the deans. I knew the president. As a matter of fact, the person who was president, William Duncan, at that time, he was the director of admissions who had interviewed me for coming to Millersville. So I knew everyone. I even knew the swimming teacher. I was a zero swimmer. I cut as much school as possible to avoid taking swimming in high school. I didn't like the water in my face. And so when I got to Millersville, I had to take swimming, and I got a D in swimming. I could swim the length of the pool on my back, and our instructor's name was Runkle. And I saw him years later when I was on the faculty, and he said, "You been in the pool recently?" I said, "No." He said, "I didn't think so." But then, 1990, I was part of the team that put together the new curriculum at Millersville. And one of the things we eliminated was swimming. So I got my revenge at the end. But it was, while at Millersville, I'm retired now, and I should say happily retired. Colleagues said, "Well, don't you miss it? Are you going to come back?" I said, "Yeah, I'll come back, but I'm not going to come back too often." Because you come back too often and people say, "Oh, here he comes again."
And how many years were you on faculty at Millersville?
36 years. And during that time, I was chair of my department 5 times. So they trusted me a little bit. And I still get questions from faculty, "Can you help me with this?" Or students who will ask me. The students had a sort of different reaction. The idea that someone black can speak German, is like, I was challenged one time by a kid. His father was German. And I told him, he was getting on my nerves. I said, "Look, I've forgotten more German than you've learned, than you will ever learn." And that shut him up. Eventually, he dropped the major. But it was, and of course, I'm old enough that sort of thing doesn't bother me. You accept me as I am, or forget about it. My mother was the same way. She had a more colorful way of saying it.
In many ways, it sounds like you were a trailblazer.
Oh, I guess so. I did the things I'd like to do or wanted to do. I was fortunate, and I got a lot of support. People of all descriptions, white and black, have helped me along the way. One of my favorites, I missed the opportunity to introduce my then wife to him, Dr. Copper. Uh, I, I got back the week after he died. He died in September of 1976. And he took a special interest in me, as did Mr. Walt Harrison, barber. Dr. Copper, that was an experience. Anyone who lived in the Southeast area knew about Dr. Copper. You would go there to his office, and you might wait 12 hours to be waited on. And they had sheets, notepads with the 18-inch. And one time my father went there, and he said, "Oh, wow, I'm first." He signed his name on the line, but then he picked up the paper. The other side was full. So he was not the first, he was the 33rd. But I would go to see Dr. Copper even when I wasn't sick, and he'd take me back in his treatment room, and we would talk for an hour. He didn't care about the other people waiting. He wanted to find out what I was doing. And of course, that's some of the things, that's the key to success for our young people. You need an adult to take interest in them, to listen to them, talk to them, encourage them. And I got,
I'm sorry.
no, and that sort of encouragement I got from the community. My church, Bethel, for example, they knew of my interest in German, and one of the things they gave me after one of my trips was they gave me the Bible in German. And when I came back, from college and from graduate school, they would have me get up and say something, and so you appreciate that. It's a recognition. Money would have been nice too, but
Sounds like they were very proud of you.
I think so. My mother was proud. My mother, it was funny. My mother and I had this sort of later in life, sort of a strained relationship. We would argue a lot. We were very similar, and of course, people who are alike will fight. But she seemed more interested or more committed to my sister, who was younger than I am, 8 years younger. But then after my mother died, I found albums that she'd filled with clips of things that I had accomplished. And we never talked about that things. We didn't share emotions at home. My mother told me that she and her parents were like that. It was, you just accepted the fact that you were family. And you did everything you could, excuse me, for your family. And you didn't ask for praise or anything like that.
Our time is just about up.
Excuse me, could Leroy make a statement? He said about,
And we're rolling again.
Can you, you've been at Millersville for a number of years, quite a few years before you retired. How many years did you work there as a faculty member?
Well, I started in Millersville in 1979, and of course everyone is hired at a certain level. I was hired as an assistant professor, and then in 5 years, about 1980 something, I became an associate professor, and then 1991 I became a full professor, and actually I was the first African American to be a full professor at Millersville. I beat out Rita by a year, Rita Smith Waddell. We were both going up at the same time. But even with that, I finished 36 years in May of last year, 2015. But one of the things is I've encouraged former colleagues who were sort of disappointed by the promotion process. And I've told them the first time I went up for promotion, they said, "You're doing things that are not related to your discipline." Because I was writing about African American history and also about Germans. And they said, "Well, that has nothing to do with it." Well, I went up the next year and I was praised because I was doing things about Germans and African Americans. And then the next time when I went for full professor, and the only benefit of promotion is you get more money. It's not like you have more prestige. They expect more of you, but you get paid more. And I went up for full professor, and it was obvious from the review that the committee had done, they hadn't read my statements. And so I went to see the vice president, who was the academic officer for the university, and I said, if I'm not recognized for what I do here, I go to conferences where I present with people from Princeton and other Ivy League schools. I can find a job somewhere else, I hoped. And he said, oh, no, 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 no. So I applied again and got promoted the next year. So even Miller's was no different than any other institution. If you don't speak up for yourself, no one will. And so I learned it was, as a child, I was probably self-effacing. I was shy, but I learned that shyness gets you nothing. So when it's necessary, I speak up. But most of the time, I could care less. I know who I am and what I can do, so I don't worry about other people's praise or criticism.
I believe we've gone full circle, starting with your childhood and those various experiences that helped to shape who you are today, moving forward to who you are now. I'd like to bring the interview to a close with two final questions. Growing up in the 7th Ward, what did you like the least and what did you like the best?
Growing up in the 7th Ward, what I liked the least, I hated the outdoor toilet. That was one of the things. Although years later I learned that 2% of all the households in the county had outdoor toilets. I hated going out there because not only was it stank, but it had bugs in there. I hate insects, even today. My future wife's son knows that I hate flies, and I'll go out of my way to kill a fly. Well, they had spiders in there. I hated that. What I liked most about the 7th Ward was the people, in everyday life. Kavanski's, I get Broker pretzels there. You get Lebanon bologna, Ali Wren's candy store, just life on the street, playing stickball in the street, getting to know people. Although I have to admit, most of the people, their full names I never knew. I'd know them by nicknames, like Blue Steel, Cadillac Jack, some that I won't mention, June Bug, Potato Bug, and so forth. But it was the sense of, it's an African proverb. It takes a village to raise a child. Well, if we did anything, the neighbor saw you, you get a beating right then. They take you home, you got another one. Miss Woodburn, yeah, that was her name, Viola Woodburn. She lived in the 400 block of North Street. And at Bethel, they were excavating to build an annex in 1949. I was playing there with a friend. I don't remember who the friend was. We were throwing rocks at each other. My aim wasn't too good, and I hit her right in the face, broke her glasses and cut her. And I don't know if I guess she must have hit me, but she took me by the scruff of my neck home, where I got another good beating. And I remember my father had to buy her a new pair of glasses, $5, which doesn't sound like much, but you have to remember the rent for our house was $10 a month. So I cost a half a month rent. And so I learned I didn't throw any more stones, at least not in public. But it was a sense that people knew who you were, knew what you were about, and actually took joy in your achievements. We've lost some of that, and which is which is actually African. Africans like the idea that someone from their group succeeds. There's no sense of envy. Today, we're much more selfish. We're much more me-centered.
Oh, no, it's not the microphone, it's your button. Okay, that's a good thing, so it's not.
All right, sorry. I'm seeing like that
Okay.
white thing occasionally, but it's actually the button, not the microphone, so, okay.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I think this is a great idea. One of the things about Lancaster, there are 9 wards, but there's only one, the ward, and that was the 7th ward. And it's something that was not just African American. We lived in the only multicultural part of this city. And, I grew up with Italians, Russian Jews, and Germans. And we all got along to a certain point. I remember I had a German friend who lived on Green Street. And when he came supper time, his mother sent me home. I wasn't allowed in the house. there was a sense of certain barriers, but other people who got friendly, and and of course it's a strange thing. If you achieve something, people remember you. Several years ago, I ran into a high school classmate out at Park City. He was walking with his teenage daughter, and he stopped me and introduced me to his daughter and told his daughter, I went to school with him. He's now a professor at Millersville. Saying like, you can achieve something too. And he was white, so I thought that was sort of nice. But on the other hand, I remember running into a classmate who was a vice president of the bank, and she said, you know, the racial problems we're having, we never had that when we were in school. I said, well, how many times did you come to my house, and how many times was I in your house? And she went, oh. That was the end of the conversation. But it's nice to be in a community where you can talk to people. And I think Americans we're superficial, but we're superficially nice most of the time.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.